Welcome to your first lecture in Econ 1050. This lecture is called The Principles of Economics. Here we'll be looking at the foundational principles that form the discipline of economics. The first question that we ask is, why do we study economics? Contrary to popular belief, economics is much more than money, inflation, and supply and demand. At its core, economics studies how people make decisions. Households, companies, whole societies face a series of decisions, and none are really too small. For example, as an individual, you may need to decide what you're going to have for dinner tonight. Or, as a firm, you may try to decide whether or not to invest in new equipment. An economy, as a whole, may think about how they're going to be funding their healthcare system. Each of these decisions has long-term impact to individuals, to firms, to industries, both locally, nationally, and globally. So economics provides valuable insights into how societies make decisions about their needs and wants and allocate the resources to achieve them. What is economics? Before we explain what economics is, we have to understand why it exists. The reason economics exists is because scarcity is everywhere. We live in a world of completely limited resources, and at the same time, as humans, we have seemingly unlimited wants and needs. Since we have the fundamental problem of scarcity, we need to study economics in order to allocate our scarce resources in the most effective ways. So, economics is the science that studies how people, firms, and societies make decisions that allow them to get the most out of their scarce resources. So let's think about some key assumptions that we make in economics, and those are the two key goals, and we'll look at the individual and the firm. The individual decides how to maximize their utility. Utility represents the advantage or fulfillment a person receives from consuming a good or service. Effectively, think of it as a way of measuring happiness or satisfaction. That is what utility represents in economics. It's a method that theoretically is created in order to quantify the idea of satisfaction from consumption of a good or service. So we ask the question, why do we buy the goods and services that we purchase? Right? The answer must be that they provide us with some kind of satisfaction and they make us feel better for having purchased them. Now let's go on to the firm. Why does a firm exist? Well, the firm's sole purpose is to maximize profit. All their decisions are made with the idea of maximizing profit. We'll look at this in a little bit more detail when we get to a later chapter where we discuss how firms are organized, and we'll start to see that there is a little bit of a movement to make the reason for the firm's existence a little bit more than purely profit maximization. So what is utility? So utility is a very abstract concept. Let's take a little bit of an example and think through this. So, a person who consumes peaches gains some kind of utility or satisfaction from eating the peaches. We can't measure this utility the same way we can measure the peach's weight, which would be just simply putting it on a scale, or the calorie content. There's no scale that we can use to determine the quantity of utility that a peach generates. So the question becomes, does everyone enjoy consuming peaches the same amount? And the answer is effectively no. Even one individual is going to enjoy consuming peaches differently at different points of time. So to help understand this idea of utility and how to measure it, Francis Edgeworth, a famous economist that some of you will get to later meet again if you study intermediate micro, he imagined a device called a hedonometer, and this is named for the word hedonism, which is the pursuit of pleasure. A hedonometer would be a device used to gauge happiness or pleasure. So he described it as an ideally perfect instrument, a psychophysical machine continually registering the height of pleasure experienced by an individual. Think about how difficult it would be to come up with an invention like this. So So let's go on. The questions that economics answers. Let's think of this from the viewpoint of the individual, the firm, and society as a whole. So an individual needs to know how people decide what to buy, how much they should work, how much they should save, how much they should spend. A firm decides how much to produce, how many workers to hire, and where to produce their output. Society as a whole decides how to divide its resources between things like national defense, consumer goods, protecting the environment, healthcare, education, and an array of many, many other choices. So this course is going to look at both micro and macroeconomics. We start our study in microeconomics where we look at households and firms and how they interact in markets and the decisions they make. We'll also have a look at how government policies will have an impact on those decision makings of the households and the firms. We'll have a look at international markets and how they impact the micro decision maker as well. The second part of our course goes on to macroeconomics. Here we'll study economy-wide phenomenon like inflation, what causes inflation, what's a recession, how do we get unemployment, how do we measure unemployment, how do we generate economic growth, how do we measure economic growth, and we'll look at different types of macroeconomic policies as well. Principles of economics. So here's the start of our first lecture. This first lecture basically goes through micro and macroeconomics to some extent. This is to help introduce you to the concepts that we're going to be talking about throughout the term. So first section of principles will be how people make decisions. The second will be how people interact. And the third is going to be how the economy works as a whole. Principle 1, people face trade-offs. Every single decision that you make in your life, you are faced with a trade-off. Examples: going to a party the night before your midterm leaves you less time for studying. If you spend your income on video games, you cannot spend it on movies. If you choose to marry one person, you give up the opportunity to marry anyone else. Let's have a look at these cartoons and see how they exhibit the idea of trade-offs. So the first one you see here with the little car, it says, naturally there's a trade-off for exceptional fuel economy, and you see you're getting a tiny little car for that. This one says, is listening to her talk about her feelings worth a tiny can of tuna? Right? These are both trade-offs for a certain end. Okay, so this is how it's illustrated. Principle 2, the cost of something is what you give up to get it. This is the key principle in economics, and it introduces us to one of the most important costs of economics, and that is the opportunity cost. This is making decisions requires compare. Okay, we're starting over. Principle 2, the cost of something is what you give up to get it. What does that mean? Well, that is defining the concept of opportunity cost, one of the most relevant costs for decision making. The idea behind opportunity cost is that the cost of one item is the lost opportunity to do or consume something else. In short, opportunity cost is the value of the next best alternative. For example, if you chose to, again, go to a party the night before the exam, what is the cost of that? Well, partially it could be the cost of the Uber ride to take to get to the party. And of course, the other part would be the time you could have spent studying in order to improve your grade. So as an individual, you made the decision by weighing those costs and benefits. And by choosing to go to the party, you decided that the benefit from the party outweighed the cost of not doing your studying the night before. This video is going to illustrate to you the concept of there's no such thing as a free lunch. This is a very important concept in economics and is an illustration of both trade-offs and opportunity costs. This is a video clip from Seinfeld. I think you guys will enjoy it.
Hey! Here you go.
Yeah.
You didn't think I was really going to give you a suit, did you?
Well, you're giving him the suit?
That's right. And it's Armani.
Armani? Hey, Armani, Jerry.
Yes,
Yeah.
I heard.
Come on, try it on.
No, it's okay.
No, come on, I want to see how it fits.
All right.
There you go.
There,
Oh,
okay.
boy, look at that. That looks great, huh? I can't believe you're giving him this.
I don't even want anything for it.
He's very generous, isn't he?
Yes, he is.
I'll tell you what, you can take me out to dinner sometime.
Dinner?
Yeah, you buy me a meal, can't get a better deal than that.
No, you'll never get a better deal than that.
All right, I'll leave you alone.
Yeah, all right. Ooh, look at that, Armani, huh?
Yeah, that's a deal. That's a terrible deal. I don't want to go out to dinner with him. I'd rather make my own suit. Hello.
Hi, Jerry, it's Kenny.
Oh, hi.
I was thinking if you're not busy, maybe I can get my meal today.
Yeah, you want to get that meal, don't you?
How about Mendy's? Ooh, ever been there?
No, I haven't.
Ah, you're gonna love it. I'll meet you there around 7.
All right. Yeah, I really needed that suit.
I start off with curls. That's good for the bicep. I do 10 reps, 2 sets.
That's fantastic.
You work out with weights?
No, I don't.
You should.
Why?
You worn the suit yet?
No, not yet.
Have you decided?
Oh, get the swordfish. Best swordfish in the city. The best, Jerry.
I'll have the salmon.
And you?
You know what I think? I'm just gonna have soup. Yeah, I'll save the meal for another time.
Another time? What other time?
I had a hot dog earlier. I'm not that hungry.
No, Ben, you know. This is the dinner. The soup counts.
Soup's not a meal. You were supposed to buy me a meal.
I'm not stopping you from eating. Go ahead and eat. Get anything you want.
But I don't want anything but soup.
Then that's the meal.
But I had the hot dog.
I didn't tell you to have a hot dog. Who told you to have a hot dog?
Hey, I give you a brand new Armani suit, and you won't even buy me a meal.
All right, fine. Get the soup.
Can I take your order?
What kind of soup do you have?
Why don't you get a sandwich?
Okay. I'll have tomato soup and tuna on toast.
Okay. This is it, you know. This is the meal. So stock up, buddy boy.
What are you talking about? This isn't a meal.
Yes, it is. Soup and sandwich. That is a meal.
You're supposed to buy me dinner in a nice restaurant like Mendy's.
I tried to do that.
This is lunch in a coffee shop.
Doesn't matter. This is it. This completes the transaction.
Oh, soup and a sandwich for a brand new Armani suit. Is that any kind of a gesture?
Principle 3. Rational people think at the margin. First question, what's a rational person? A rational person is someone who systematically and purposefully does the best they can to achieve their objectives. They make decisions by evaluating costs and benefits of marginal changes or incremental adjustments to an existing plan. What's a marginal change? Well, marginal change is thinking about a decision and saying, well, I'm not thinking about it in its entirety, but I'm thinking about it in terms of the additional benefit or cost it'll have. So for example, let's say you have an exam tomorrow, and for that exam you have to study a certain amount of time. So if you've already studied several hours throughout the day, and you're like, okay, well, based on my studying, I'm confident I'm at a C level. And then you think to yourself, well, should I study one more hour? Well, that's a marginal change. Should I study one more hour? The answer, of course, depends. What are the potential benefits of studying one more hour? Could your grade go up, say, 10%? Or could it go up 20 or 30%, depending on how much you had studied before? Now, if you've already studied 30 hours, haven't slept, I'd say the best choice would be probably not to study, as additional time given up sleeping is probably going to cost you in the exam as well. Now, again, just to illustrate this a little bit more in terms of marginal thinking, because marginal thinking or marginal costs, marginal benefits, marginal utility, etc., this is going to be a really important concept in economics. So think of it this way. Let's think of satisfaction and utility. The first glass of lemonade on a hot day, or water, quenches your thirst. But the next glass, maybe not so much. Let's say you're really hungry. You order a whole pizza. And the first slice is just fantastic, delicious, great. Is the second slice going to give you the same level of satisfaction? Maybe, maybe not. It's not entirely clear, but we pretty much know that by the time we get to the end of that large pizza and we're still eating additional slices, it's going to start to make you feel sick. So if you think at the margin, you're thinking what the next or additional action means to you. Will this decision make me better off or worse off? We'll look a little bit more into the semantics of marginal decision-making in later sections. Let's do a little example. Let's think marginally. You are having friends over for a party at home and you need to prepare by cleaning up. You have 20 minutes. What do you clean? Do you vacuum or do you clean the dust under the fridge? Well, let's think marginally, right? The time investment is exactly the same, right? That costs you 20 minutes regardless. Now, what about the benefit side? Well, if you spend 20 minutes dusting under your fridge, is anyone really going to notice, right? The benefit in that case, or the additional benefit of dusting under your fridge, is almost zero. You may feel nice that it's clean under there, but it doesn't really contribute to what you were going for. However, if you vacuum with that 20 minutes, you get a much bigger payoff that your home looks clean. Hopefully this illustrates this concept a little bit better. Principle 4, people respond to incentives. An incentive is something that induces a person to act. So this is a prospect of a reward or a prospect of punishment. Some people respond more to rewards than punishments, whereas others respond more to punishments than to reward. So the rational person in the assumption we make in economics is that rational people respond to incentives. So here's a question for you guys that you can consider during our next Zoom session. How can I incentivize you to attend every Zoom session and submit all your assignments? I'll let you guys have a think about that. This is a great video on incentives. And this looks at the literature from behavioral economics and Richard Thaler and the contributions that he made in helping people effectively make better choices by providing them with little nudges. You'll enjoy this video. The next set of principles is how people interact. Principle 5, trade can make everyone better off. Now, here we're not talking about international trade. Here we're talking about trade in terms of the difference between the ability to trade with other individuals and being self-sufficient. So basically we're saying that if someone doesn't have to be self-sufficient, and by self-sufficient we mean you gather your own food, you create your own shelter, etc., whatever needs are required for life, you do them yourself. Whereas with trade, you can specialize in producing or creating a certain type of good or service, and then with that income, being able to buy other goods and services from society. So that's a little bit like comparing a world of Robinson Crusoe to the world of our modern economy. Principle 6, markets are usually a good way to organize activity. Principle 6, markets are usually a good way to organize economic activity. First question is, what is a market? A market, very simply, is a group of buyers and sellers. It can range from something like a giant grocery store, or it could be, a transaction that you made from, Facebook or something like that. Now, the next part, organizing economic activity, answers a few questions. First, as a whole economy, how do we decide what goods to produce? How do we produce them? How much of each good do we produce? And who gets them? In a market economy, these decisions are made in a decentralized way, meaning that no one entity or government decides the answers to all of these questions. Our modern market economy is based on the writings of Adam Smith in his famous book, The Wealth of Nations from 1776. He defines a market as a market economy as one that allocates resources through the decentralized decisions of many households and firms as they interact in markets. So his famous insight states, each household and firm acts as if led by an invisible hand to promote the general economic well-being. So the invisible hand works through the price system. The price system basically is impacted by the interaction of the buyers and sellers as they basically make decisions through the market system. Each price of each good reflects the good's value to the buyer and also the good's cost of production to the seller. Prices guide self-interested households and firms to make decisions that in many cases maximize society's well-being. That statement, that final statement of how prices guide self-interested households is the concept of the invisible hand. So Adam Smith has a famous insight from his Wealth of Nations book, and it says, it's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard to their own interest. Now, what does that mean? It means that the brewer is not purely brewing for the betterment of society. He's brewing beer so that he can sell the beer. And later on, when he's ready for dinner, buy some bread from the baker and some meat from the butcher. So the self-interest axiom is basically theoretically the guiding force of the market system, where the buyers and sellers making their own decisions about how to benefit themselves unknowingly benefit society by pursuing the maximization of their utility. Now, one thing I want you guys to consider as we're going through your guided notes is the self-interest, the way Adam Smith described it in this case. Is it the same as being selfish? Okay, I'll let you guys ponder on that. Now, what are the alternatives to the market? Well, we've seen a few examples. So the pure alternative and the exact opposite of a market is an economy that is centrally planned. So in a market, decisions are made in a decentralized way by buyers and sellers. But in a centrally planned economy, all decisions are made by the governing party. So the questions about what goods to produce, how to produce them, how many to produce, etc., are answered by this body. And if you ever would like to, a very, very difficult thinking procedure, I'd like you guys to think about if you could ever predict how many cars to produce in the United States every year to make sure, there's enough to go around, or how much food to produce, or how many, I don't know, pieces of jewelry to produce, or how many computers to produce. How are you going to distribute these? It becomes very difficult. When you have a market and prices, those distribution decisions are basically made by buyers and sellers and their own internal preferences. So back to our centrally planned economy. So if we look at the USSR, the Soviet Union, this was a great experimental failure of the centrally planned market system. This started in 1917 and went to 1991. In this type of system, the objective of the government dictates production and consumption decisions across the board. So the idea behind this system was that you work for the common good. Everyone contributes to this society, and technically what was supposed to happen is that every individual was supposed to get an exact equal share of the collective. Now, people respond to incentives, as we've learned before. And if they perceive that they may be getting gains from trade without necessarily participating in the production or working, etc., they may be getting incentives without even trying. So this illustration that you see here, it says communism versus capitalism. This is the night sky over the Korean peninsula, right? So this is our South Korea, there's Seoul, and here's North Korea. Notice something strange, right? These lights here in Korea are very, very bright in South Korea. Look in North Korea. There's only one light in the capital city of Pyongyang, right? Not much is going on. Now notice you can practically not distinguish the North Korea from basically the Sea of Japan and the Yellow Sea on the side. Now why is this an important example? Well, North Korea and South Korea were one country. When they split after the Korean War and North Korea embraced communism and South Korea embraced a market economy, what you saw was this discrepancy. Principle 7. Governments can sometimes improve market outcomes. So there's a very, very important role for the government when we talk about microeconomics, and that is the enforcement of property rights. A property right is the exclusive authority to determine how a resource is used, whether that resource is owned by the government or by individuals. People are less inclined to work, produce, invest, or purchase if there's a large risk of their property being stolen, right? Think about it. Would you go out and buy the nicest and most expensive car in the marketplace if you knew the chance of that car being stolen was close to 80%? Probably not. So you'd get much less consumption and much less production in those types of industries. So certain times we see markets that fail. A market failure is when the market fails on its own to allocate society's resources effectively or efficiently. Now, what are some causes of market failure? The first is externalities, and this is when the production or consumption of a good affects bystanders. So a bystander is defined as someone that is outside of the buyer-seller or market operation, we could think of it, or transaction. So a good example of this would be pollution, effects of secondhand smoke, etc. We have instances of positive externalities like vaccinations. When someone's vaccinated, that means they can't infect others around them. Think about, what the prospect is when we have a vaccine for coronavirus. If many of us get the vaccine, then we reduce the potential for community spread, and hopefully we can get back to our normal functioning lives. The second cause of market failure is market power. And this is when a single buyer or seller starts to generate a substantial influence on a market price. So this is like a monopoly. Think about organizations or companies that have so much power where they become pretty much the only supplier of a certain good. And we'll look at several examples of these when we get to a later chapter. So what else can the government do to improve the market? They can create public policy that promotes efficiency. They can create government outcomes or policies that create equity or equality for society. And if the market distribution of well-being is not desirable, they can enact tax and welfare policies that can change how the economic pie is divided. So this video here is going to illustrate a little bit of a problem in the United States of inequality. Now, there is a general, very well-developed economic idea that there is a trade-off between efficiency and equity, which means that if society strives to become more and more efficient, they can effectively become less equal. So have a look at this video and let's see what you guys think.
There's a chart I saw recently that I can't get out of my head. A Harvard business professor and economist asked more than 5,000 Americans how they thought wealth was distributed in the United States. This is what they said they thought it was. Dividing the country into 5 rough groups of the top, bottom, and middle 3 20% groups, they asked people how they thought the wealth in this country was divided. Then he asked them what they thought was the ideal distribution. And 92%, that's at least 9 out of 10 of them, said it should be more like this. In other words, more equitable than they think it is. Now that fact is telling, admittedly, the notion that most Americans know that the system is already skewed unfairly. But what's most interesting to me is the reality compared to our perception. The ideal is as far removed from our perception of reality as the actual distribution is from what we think exists in this country. So ignore the ideal for a moment. Here's what we think it is again. And here is the actual distribution. Shockingly skewed. Not only do the bottom 20% and the next 20%, the bottom 40% of Americans barely have any of the wealth. I mean, it's hard to even see them on the chart. But the top 1% has more of the country's wealth than 9 out of 10 Americans believe the entire top 20% should have. Mind-blowing. But let's look at it another way, because I find this chart kind of difficult to wrap my head around. Instead, let's reduce the 311 million Americans to just a representative 100 people. Make it simple. Here they are: teachers, coaches, firefighters, construction workers, engineers, doctors, lawyers, some investment bankers, a CEO, maybe a celebrity or two. Now let's line them up according to their wealth. Poorest people on the left, wealthiest on the right, just a steady row of folks based on their net worth. We'll color code them like we did before based on which 20% quintile they fall into. Now let's reduce the total wealth of the United States, which was roughly $54 trillion in 2009, to this symbolic pile of cash. And let's distribute it among our 100 Americans. Well, here's socialism, all the wealth of the country distributed equally. We all know that won't work. We need to encourage people to work and work hard to achieve that good old American dream and keep our country moving forward. So, here's that ideal we asked everyone about. Something like this curve. This isn't too bad. We've got some incentive, as the wealthiest folks are now about 10 to 20 times better off than the poorest Americans. But hey, even the poor folks aren't actually poor, since the poverty line has stayed almost entirely off the chart. We have a super healthy middle class with a smooth transition into wealth. And yes, Republicans and Democrats alike chose this curve. 9 out of 10 people, 92%, said this was a nice, ideal distribution of America's wealth. But let's move on. This is what people think America's wealth distribution actually looks like. Not as equitable, clearly, but for me, even this still looks pretty great. Yes, the poorest 20 to 30% are starting to suffer quite a lot compared to the ideal, and the middle class is certainly struggling more than they were, while the rich and wealthy are making roughly 100 times that of the poorest Americans, and about 10 times that of the still healthy middle class. Sadly, this isn't even close to the reality. Here is the actual distribution of wealth in America. The poorest Americans don't even register. They're down to pocket change, and the middle class is barely distinguishable from the poor. In fact, even the rich between the top 10 and 20 percentile are worse off. Only the top 10% are better off. And how much better off? So much better off that the top 2 to 5% are actually off the chart at this scale. And the top 1%, this guy, well, his stack of money stretches 10 times higher than we can show. Here's his stack of cash, restacked, all by itself. This is the top 1% we've been hearing so much about. So much green in his pockets that I have to give him a whole new column of his own, because he won't fit on my chart. 1% of America has 40% of all the nation's wealth. The bottom 80%, 8 out of every 10 people, or 80 out of these 100, only has 7% between them. And this has only gotten worse in the last 20 to 30 years. While the richest 1% take home almost a quarter of the national income today, in 1976 they took home only 9%, meaning their share of income has nearly tripled in the last 30 years. The top 1% own half the country's stocks, bonds, and mutual funds. The bottom 50% of Americans own only 0.5% of these investments, which means they aren't investing. They're just scraping by. I'm sure many of these wealthy people have worked very hard for their money, but do you really believe that the CEO is working 380 times harder than his average employee? Not his lowest paid employee, not the janitor, but the average earner in his company. The average worker needs to work more than a month to earn what the CEO makes in 1 hour. We certainly don't have to go all the way to socialism to find something that is fair for hardworking Americans. We don't even have to achieve what most of us consider might be ideal. All we need to do is wake up and realize that the reality in this country is not at all what we think it is.
Principle 8. A country's standard of living depends on its ability to produce goods and services. So there's a huge variation in living standards across countries and over time. Average income in rich countries is more than 10 times average income in poor countries. Currently, if we just think about a country, our own country across time, the standard of living today is 8 times larger than it was 100 years ago. Now the question is, how are we defining standard of living? Is it like a survey we all did to say, well, I really enjoyed living and so on? It's not. In this case, to make it quantitatively measurable, we use GDP per capita to measure standard of living. GDP per capita is the gross domestic product divided by everyone in the population. So we'll have a look at details of this as we get to a later chapter where we'll be learning about GDP. So produce goods and services. So the most important determinant of living standards is productivity. And this is the amount of goods and services produced per unit of labor. Productivity depends on equipment, skills, and technology available to workers. So in the United States, we have incredibly high productivity, along with countries like Japan and Germany that also have very, very high levels of productivity. Is it because our workers are, extremely better or extremely more skilled? Well, part of our productivity actually comes from our equipment and our machinery. So basically, a country that has really good high-skilled workers, really good equipment, and really high-level technology tends to have higher standards of living. This video, 200 Countries, 200 Years in 4 Minutes, basically looks at the evolution of world history in terms of living standards, GDP per capita, as compared to health outcomes, which is the life expectancy. This is a fascinating video. Have a look at this. We'll discuss it during our Zoom session.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go.
First, an axis for health, life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400,000, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up, Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Finally, Principle 9. Prices rise when government prints too much money. So this is the concept of inflation. So inflation is the increase in the general level of prices. So more dollars chasing the same amount of goods. So in the long run, inflation is almost always caused by excessive growth in the quantity of money, which basically would cause the value of money to fall. So you can think of it as a lever. When you increase the quantity of money, you reduce the value of that money. The faster the government creates money, the greater the rates of inflation. In the next few weeks, we will look at several cases of governments that caused massive hyperinflations in their economies, and ended up with very incredibly terrible conditions. We'll look particularly at the cases of Zimbabwe and Venezuela. The last little concept here is our little video on inflation, which will illustrate the idea. So this is the end of our first lecture. And what I would like to prepare you for is, so this is the end of lecture 1. We'll have similar lectures for every single one of our topic areas. Each lecture comes with a set of guided notes that you will follow and take notes on as we go through the course. Hopefully this will help you pay attention and also answer certain questions. Our Zoom sessions will allow you guys to ask questions about these lectures, and we'll ask you to do group work and certain practice problems throughout the rest of the course. Well, see you in the next lecture.